Merci beaucoup d'être présent au Toulouse Storygraphes et à cette conférence que j'ai l'honneur de présenter. Donc je vais vous lire des notes. Je déteste lire quand je présente quelque chose, mais là je dois lire parce que c'est des citations. Donc il y a 5 étoiles, c'est le Guardian. Un chef-d'œuvre absolu, gameblog.fr. De la même façon que l'on parle d'un Tarantino ou d'un Audiard, il faudrait désormais parler d'un Barlow, l'un des nouveaux grands noms du jeu vidéo, ça c'est Le Monde. Telling Lies, où l'enfant brillant du jeu vidéo et de la série télévisée, c'est les Inrocks. L'une des aventures les plus stimulantes de l'année, Game Cult. Voilà, donc ça c'est quelques petites quotes, citations de journaux de ces 3 dernières semaines qui parlent du dernier jeu vidéo que Sam Barlow, ici présent, a créé et dont il est l'auteur. Et donc nous sommes extrêmement fiers de l'accueillir. Et tout particulièrement parce que justement, il fait, grâce à son jeu vidéo, et même le jeu vidéo précédent, le pont, selon nous, entre le jeu vidéo, le cinéma. Et c'est ce que nous aimons tout particulièrement au Storygraphes, c'est justement mélanger les genres. Et voilà. Donc nous sommes ravis de l'accueillir et je le laisse parler parce qu'il est beaucoup plus intéressant que moi. Donc j'espère que vous allez... Alors ah oui, j'ai une question à vous poser. Est-ce qu'on a un interprète? Est-ce que vous êtes tous super à l'aise avec l'anglais et on n'a pas besoin d'interprète et ça fluidifie les choses? Ou est-ce qu'il y en a, et n'ayez pas du tout de problème à nous le dire, qui préfèrent qu'il y ait un interprète et il n'y a pas de souci, il est là, mais c'est juste ça rallonge les choses. Voilà. Donc est-ce que quelqu'un ou est-ce que plusieurs personnes ont besoin qu'il y ait l'interprète? Il n'y a pas de souci de le dire. Sinon, on y va en anglais. Ok, on le fait en anglais donc. Ok, so it will be only in English. No translation, so okay. If you can be slowly, like, for us, thanks.
I'll try. I'll see if the jet lag helps. Hello. So I'm Sam Barlow, and I just recently released this game, Telling Lies. Has anyone here played Telling Lies? We have a few. That's good. So we have a baseline. Just a quick background for me. I've been making video games for about 15 years or more. Notably, in 1999, I made this text game, Isle, which was a game about a man in a supermarket with 130 different endings to the story. But you only ever had one turn, so it was this very shallow, multiverse kind of thing. It was a fun game. In 2009, I made Silent Hill Shattered Memories. That was not my choice of title, that was the publisher. This was a game about grief told through the framing device of a therapy session, and was pretty interesting. In 2015, I went independent and made a game all by myself. This was the game Her Story, which was notable for using filmed footage of an actress rather than a computer model, and was a game about a series of police interviews concerning a dead husband, and was a big hit. I followed it up with the aforementioned Telling Lies, which came out a month ago. And this kind of builds on what I'd done with Her Story. It is a game about private conversations. The premise of the game is you see a woman who has stolen a computer database full of secretly recorded webcam conversations between 4 individuals. And it is up to the player to figure out why who are these people, what connects them. It's a game about privacy and intimacy. And if I go here, I was going to read this out, but there's a lot of English and it's kind of dull. So instead, this was the first page of the script. So when it was sent to agents and actors, this was trying to explain exactly what this thing was and how it would work. But now that we've finished, I can actually just boot up the game. If it plays nice. Okay. I'll just show you a couple of minutes from the start of the game so you can all get a sense of exactly what this thing is. See this woman logging into her computer, and for the remainder of the game, everything will take place on this computer desktop. So yeah, the entirety of the game takes place on this computer. So we call it a desktop thriller, I think, sometimes. And you can play around on the computer if you wish, but the core of the game is this NSA database. And if we search for words in this database, we will find clips. And for example, here we have searched for the word love. If I click on one of these clips, to my honey I'll croon love's tune. We get dropped into these secretly recorded conversations at the point where the person uses the word. So instantly we have questions: who is this person? Who are they talking to? Where are they? What is happening? One of the key aspects of the game is you only ever see one side of the conversation at any time. So you're only ever seeing half of the conversation, and you're filling in the gaps. Honeymoon keeps it shining in June. Your silvery beams will bring love's dreams. We'll be cuddling soon by the silvery moon. The player can scrub around in this footage to explore it and enjoy it. And then if we see another word which is curiously interesting, we click it. And in doing this, we can discover further conversations or find other sides to the conversation. Above the silvery moon. So the player will, at their own pace, explore, search for words that are interesting to them and therefore have a kind of subjective route through the game.
All right, love you. Dinner, soup, because her tooth hurt.
And when the tooth falls out, okay? No. Listen. When that tooth falls out, the tooth fairy's gonna come and she's gonna give you money for it.
The tooth fairy? What did she do with the tape? How did she even get into my room?
So that is the basic setup of the game. There are over 10 hours worth of footage here, and it spans 2 years in the lives of these characters, and you are free to search through it in whatever order you find, to take your time, to jump back and forth. Very much it's up to the player to tweak the pacing and almost view this in a way that's expressive. They can kind of stop and DJ the footage as they're watching it. So rather than spoil any more, I will quit out of this. And we can talk about how I went around writing something like this, this big non-linear jigsaw puzzle of a game. So all of my projects start in a very similar way. Usually the start of a project, I have two things. I have a feeling, something that I want to communicate and have other people feel intensely, and then a metaphor. And the metaphor is an idea that is going to explain to the player what is expected of them. It's often the framework for the gameplay, the interactivity, as well as the kind of theme. And I'll break that down for you here. So with Telling Lies, the feeling that I really wanted to communicate and have people share was how it feels as a human being to think back on a failed relationship. The way our memories work, you have happy memories, sad memories, you have sensory memories, emotional memories, and when you think of those memories, when you think of that relationship, there isn't like a single solid image in your head. You have these little moments, you jump around the timeline in your head, and even in the cases of a very bad relationship, and some of the relationships in this game are very bad, it's hard to ignore the fact that there were high points, there were happy moments. And I was interested in having people enter into this fictional world and have that sense of feeling about these relationships, trying to encapsulate all of the kind of moments within this time span. And I put up some photos there from the director, Nicholas Roeg, British director. He was very interested in memory and the subjective experience of memory. And a lot of his movies would use nonlinear editing to mash together different bits and pieces of the character's experience. And he was super interested in the middle photo there, that's from the film Walkabout. When Nicholas Roeg first went into an editing room as a young boy, and he saw the old movie roller machines, and the first time he saw someone rewind footage and saw things play backwards, he was blown away. To him, this was kind of magic, and he uses that in some films, including Walkabout, to give the footage more of a subjective feeling. We're not seeing reality, we're seeing someone else imposing their will on time. So these were the kinds of feelings that I wanted to communicate. And for my metaphor, I was focused on the surveillance job, the idea, and we see this in popular culture a lot, the act of someone being surveilled, whether that's a wiretap or a stakeout, it's a cop thing or a spy thing. And for me, the exciting thing here was if you think of the scenarios where somebody is spying on someone else for a period of time to the point where they become very intimately connected to that person's life and can start feeling part of that person's life and often know more about that person than they might themselves. And the texture of the surveillance job is one in which things take a very long time. There is boredom and frustration. You are not just seeing the dramatic moments from a life. You are seeing the minutiae, the everyday domestic stuff, as well as those kind of big dramatic moments. So with this way of thinking of projects, I have this kind of feeling that I can feel in my heart, and that is the thing I'm always aiming for. And then I have the framework of this metaphor. So, looking at movies that I was paying attention to, The Conversation with Gene Hackman is a story of a man who records a conversation, and the whole movie he listens again and again to this conversation to try and understand the truth of it. And there's something very tactile about the machinery of his tape machine and how he sits and listens and slows it down and speeds it up. And that was something I kind of grabbed onto. And this metaphor is a guide for the players as well. So in the bottom right there we have, I don't know if this show was big in France, it was The Night Of, which we had on HBO here, which was it was a very cool cop show that didn't do a lot of the cop stuff. But in the final episode, they had the cliche where the policeman watches hours and hours of CCTV footage until he spots the one clue that solves the whole case and reveals who the murderer was. But again, some of these cliches are very useful to me because when someone sits to play the game, they know the cliches, they know the tropes, and so they kind of know what their job is. They understand that they can search through this footage. There will be lots of it. It will be time-consuming. There is work involved in watching, but it's their job to find these little discoveries. So that was basically the starting point for Telling Lies, was understanding that the framework was all of these ideas around surveillance, and that we were going for that kind of emotional heart. And then there follows lots and lots of research, which is not super interesting. On this project, we probably spent about 6 months, me working with a researcher, reading lots of things, watching obviously lots of movies, interviewing people. So in this story, spoilers, there is an FBI agent and his wife. We have a cam girl, so we spoke to wives of FBI agents to try and understand how their lives work. And for me, research is fundamental. I think if you go out to write and you haven't done your research, it's like trying to bake a cake without any ingredients. You're kind of inventing everything, and when you try and invent things, you often resort to cliche. So for me, if you fill your brain up with research, then you have a lot more to draw upon. You have the more interesting answers to some of the questions. You have textures and things which are real and authentic. So we do a lot of research. And when we feel like we've done enough of that, then we get to my favorite bit, breaking the story. So this is not dissimilar to how this would be done in a conventional movie. I'm very fond of structure. I will spend all the time on this step until I'm very happy with the outline and the structure. So at this stage, we're not writing any dialogue. We have basically here, so we have 4 main characters in Telling Lies. Each character gets a column, and this will scroll down very far. I think we have about 100 beats, story moments in this story. And we spend all our time just on this sheet, figuring out across the 2 years of our story, what are the characters doing, making sure that the different character stories are balanced against each other. There is, I think I've called it rigor up here, there is a test. So people often ask, how does Telling Lies or her story still feel like a story, even though the player is choosing what order to see things. Like, it still kind of hangs together. And part of that is each of these characters has their own thematic question and subject matter. And what we do is each of these cells has to in some way address that character's fundamental question. And we also have smaller sequences. So, for example, the character played by Kerry Bichet, her story itself is primarily concerned with control. She is in a relationship in which her husband is very controlling, not necessarily in an overt way. She has a mother who in turn is very controlling. And her story is what happens when her husband is physically away from her and how she reclaims some agency. How does she cope when her mother becomes ill, and the dynamic of that relationship shifts. So every single scene with that character in some way explores that question. So even if you're just dropping into random scenes, there is this thematic cohesion to them. And so that's something we play around with a lot at this stage, trying to make sure that every moment is justified. There are no random scenes. Even in fun little diversions, we have a scene where you get to see her pulling her daughter's tooth out in her sleep, which is like a very strange, surreal scene. But that still ties into those questions. One of the things that was super useful on this project, and again, it's something I always look for, is finding some structural constraint or limitation that becomes a powerful tool. So the premise here is we are only ever seeing the moments in the story where characters are talking to each other on their webcams. So if we have a scenario where a husband and wife are in the same room, we will never see that. There's no reason that this would be recorded on their webcams. So we find that a lot of the bigger plot events are occurring off-screen. So part of the act of breaking the story is to figure out if these big events are happening in a character's life, but we don't see it, what is the scene that happens after that event? What is the scene that precedes it? Which becomes much more interesting, because rather than just seeing the event, you're going to see the effects of it on the character. You might have to infer it or extract what has happened from the way they're behaving and their performance. So we find ourselves essentially painting the story in the negative space. And yeah, that's when I'm creating a story, because the possibilities are endless, it's much easier for me if we have these kind of limitations. So with her story, the limitation there was quite obvious. All of the footage in her story was of a woman being interrogated by the police. So the only things you saw were answers that she was giving to the police. So we had this very tight framework, and then within that, we could push against it and try and find every interesting variation on what can this woman say in this police interrogation room. So once we have the outline and everything is perfect and looks beautifully laid out and we're hitting all the points we want to hit, then we go away and write the script. And again, this, particularly here, this script looks like a normal movie script. It happens to be very long and pretty much is pure dialogue. But we take the outline, and in a case of Telling Lies, we write for each character chronologically. So we're able to track individual character stories and have that kind of proceed in a way which feels very organic. Particularly with this project, the premise that we are seeing secretly recorded webcam footage means that we didn't want scenes to look like movie scenes. You know, in a movie, characters come in, say something, someone else says something, they say something back, end scene, we move on. I think the ideal is most movie scenes are 1 or 2 pages long. We wanted this to be the opposite of that. In fact, we referred to it as an anti-movie during development. And so when we came to write the scenes, we would have the outline which would tell us very high level what is happening here. This person is angry because of this person wants this, and then we would just write and let the characters talk to each other. We gave them license to not talk. If a husband and wife are comfortable with each other, they might be comfortable with silence, they might just sit and stew in their emotions. So we were very happy to embrace a more naturalistic, kind of organic writing when actually hitting up the scenes. And like I say, this ended up very, very long. So we're working with Anna Perna on this, and they've obviously done some very good, very, very good movies. And the whole story development process was done with involvement from their story department on the movie side. And when we delivered the first script and dropped it down, and it was like 250 or 300 pages, they were like, this is cool, this is the most exciting part, this is where we start cutting, this is where we get to take this 250 pages and make it 90 or 100 pages. But in the case of this, we were like, you can't do that, because all those extra pages, all those scenes that run on for 7 pages, not 1 page, is part of the texture. And even little bits and scenes that are in the outline that do not directly hit the A plot, but are there to illustrate theme, to illustrate character, and also to give the sense that when these scenes are captured, we're not only capturing the most essential scenes, we are getting insights into these characters' lives and what's going on with them. So we didn't cut the script, we just iterated it and made it good. So up until this point, we haven't worried at all, really, about the gameplay. We haven't sat with a game design hat on. As you saw, the key navigation in this experience is by searching against words. And so it's very important what words characters use, because that is how the whole thing fits together. But we don't have that in our heads when we sit down and write the script. We don't try and engineer that when we're writing the script. We try and keep it as natural as possible. And then the next step, we finally start thinking about game design. So the first thing we do, we have a cool tool that will take the screenplay, imports the screenplay, and turns it into little movies that are just each character's dialogue extracted. So we can basically play the game with just a black screen and the words in the right places, and just get a sense for timing. We can play it as if all the footage was there and jump between scenes and just get a sense of how it feels. So that's a very kind of organic way. And then the key step is this spreadsheet here, which is like 10,000 times bigger than this and makes my MacBook crash. And what we do here is we plug the script of the game into this, and it does some calculations and basically tells us if one scene, so maybe there's a moment near the end of the game where 2 characters are talking, but the words that they're using are not unique enough. So it's very hard to find this clip. And then we can go and fix that. Or it might tell us we're using one word too much, or maybe there's a couple of synonyms that we can combine and make everything more connected. And we keep iterating the script and running it through this to the point where the numbers tell us that the thing is balanced. And it's actually a horrible process for a writer to go through, because it highlights all of those ticks. So for me, I always use just in dialogue. Characters will always be saying, oh, I'm just going to go and do this. Give me 1 minute, I'm just. And like, no matter whoever the character is, whatever unique voice, they all use that. So you see that laid bare by the numbers, and it's horrible. But yeah, we spend a lot of time iterating this so that it all makes sense. And you can kind of, I don't know what step this was, but this graph here is kind of roughly showing all of the clips in the game, left to right, and how difficult it is to find them. So you'll see that generally, as you go right, things get harder to find. And there is this variance, and there are a few spikes. Those very low spikes are clips that are harder to find. But it might be that if you look at those, it might be that there's only 2 words that will get you to that clip, but they're particularly potent or kind of interesting words. So we're not too worried about people not finding those clips. So we do lots and lots of this. And then we have a script that is now balanced. Then we do some testing. So what we do, I chose the least embarrassing photos of me here. We do a read through, so I played some of the parts. That is me as an FBI manager there in my suit, and then me as a very upset man on the right there. Oh, what's going on? And then some proper actors on the left. So we did a big read through of all 10 hours of this thing, chopped it up, put it into the game, and then we did a series of play tests where we bring people in and they play for 3 or 4 hours. And we capture all of their data. And this will tell us if the game is working or not. You can see at the top there, so basically we have there are 4 main characters in this game. The 3 women are essentially the 3 protagonists. That's also a spoiler. And from this, you can see if things were not working in an interesting way, you would imagine seeing a random distribution. So the 3 different colors show that in a given session, how much time are they spending with each character. So the very top one, you can see they do a little bit of pink, and then 1 red scene, and then there's a whole chunk of green. And what we're interested in seeing is that if people are searching against words or they're clicking on things that are interesting, they're probably doing it because they want to follow a certain thread in the story or dig deeper into certain events or themes. So we wanted to check that this was not just random, they weren't just jumping willy-nilly between scenes, that they were able to kind of chase down threats. And so you can see stretches where they're essentially interrogating a certain character or going back and forth between some characters. So this is kind of cool. And then the graphs on the bottom, this is showing people's, if I'm right, movement through the timeline. So I think at the very bottom is the beginning of the story, and at the very top, it's 2 years in, the end of the story. So you can see that people are jumping back and forth through the timeline, which is what we want. And then the red dots are moments where people are managing to jump back and forth between the 2 sides of one conversation. So there's like a fun gameplay where if you see a character looking very sad and they say, "Shut up, I hate bananas," you might click banana, and then you'll discover the other side of the conversation where someone's like, "Oh, I bought you lots of nice bananas." So you're kind of listening for those little rhetorical hooks that allow you to jump back and forth. So we were interested in seeing if people were able to do that. And this particular test, I think it was working pretty good. So we did a bunch of these tests, and they were all very positive, despite the fact that half of the acting was me, and I'm a very bad actor. So that gave us the confidence to then proceed to actually shooting this thing. So when it came to filming, we had our script, which had now been balanced by the computer and then iterated through all of these tests. So at this point, the actors were not allowed to diverge from the script. So every actor had to learn all of their lines perfectly. And in fact, forgetting lines wasn't the problem. The bigger problem was if they ad-libbed something, especially a swear word. We found that like when characters swear, it's usually in an emotional moment, and we had calibrated it so different characters would use different swear words. So for example, Kerry would get upset because her character wasn't allowed to say fuck, because that was Alexandra's character. So she had scenes where she had to say screw, which she didn't feel was as sexy. But yeah, we have the actors and they have to learn this huge script. And then I started asking for very complicated things from our crew. So if you're shooting a conventional show and you have two characters talking, you might not even have them always together. You might have a stand-in, or someone is just talking to the camera and then you put it all together later. But if the premise of this game was that there was something interesting in seeing these intimate moments that were slower, where there was room for silence between people that knew each other, it was very important to me that the energy feel very authentic, that if we were going to watch a character for 40 seconds listening to someone else, that the way they were reacting had to be real, that there had to be something for them to bounce off of. So early on, I insisted that we shoot all of our scenes simultaneously in 2 locations. So if you see Logan speaking to Kerry, we had 2 crews in 2 locations, and they have, you can see in the bottom left, they have these mini cameras which function basically like a phone or a laptop. So when they're having their webcam conversations with each other, they can see the other actor on the other side. These things are pretty light. It was very important to me that the body language of how we use these devices was authentic, and that the actors were free to move around in the space. So one of the other constraints we had, it would have been very easy to shoot this, or easier to shoot this on a soundstage, build sets, and then we could wire everything up, and it would make this thing slightly easier to do. But I thought it was important that the spaces that the characters inhabited be real, and they would be surrounded on all sides. So, you know, if you're shooting on a set, you might not have a ceiling, you might not have a back wall, and so the actor is going to be aware that they can never tilt the camera up like this, or that they always have to keep their back here. Whereas what I wanted was, when these characters are inhabiting these moments, we have the entire location around them, everything is dressed so that it's all real and they can point the camera where they want. So although the actors were very limited by the script in terms of the words they could say, what we would do every day is we would arrive on location and rehearse, and they then had a lot of freedom to figure out what they were doing with their bodies, how they were going to use the location. And this is such critical information to the player. If I see a call, I can tell from just the body language, where is somebody sitting, how are they sitting, can have a pretty good sense of who they're talking to. And, you know, I was saying earlier, when I was writing this, I was doing lots of traveling, promoting her story, and so I would Skype my family from hotel rooms, and I was very mindful that, you know, before I initiate the FaceTime call, I would kind of make sure the palm trees are behind me, and it's a flattering shot, and start talking to my wife, and at some point, you know, she says, oh, something really bad happened with the kids today. So then I'd be like, oh, sorry, and I'd sit down and completely change my body language, and all of that it's like an extra limb for the actors to use to try and communicate what's happening with their characters. So it's very important that we had that freedom, and that, you know, they're operating these cameras themselves, which is not how things normally work. You know, we had a camera department that never got to actually hold the camera, but they dealt with it. They were good. So yeah, we got stuck in and we filmed. Normally for like a movie, I think it's 2 or 3 minutes of footage a day. For a TV show, you may be pushing to like 7 minutes. We had some days where we were shooting 20 minutes. But because of the way we were shooting, we would have these very long single takes. So, you know, you might get 6 minutes through a take, and then a helicopter goes overhead, or something falls over, or the actor forgets their lines, and you'd have to start again. So it's extremely suspenseful and traumatic up until you get the shot. But then as soon as you have the shot that you want, you can move on. You don't have to shoot coverage and stuff, so you can kind of move a lot faster if things go well. And then there's a couple of other things we did. So we shot all of that footage, and we ended up with, I think it's about 100 hours of footage that we whittled down to 10 hours for the game. And then on top of that, we added a few little things. So it was very important to me that, and you saw a bit of this in the intro to the game, not only is there the abstraction of the computer desktop, which serves as a kind of interesting way of pulling the player into the experience, you can see at all times the reflection of the person who really is sat in front of the computer. And you can also hear, especially if you have good headphones, the sound of her apartment around her. And we kind of lean on that as a way of reminding you that this is not real. Like, I think all artwork uses the frame. I think there's something inherent to good stories where you have this combination of distance from the story itself and then the kind of emotional closeness. And for us, having that extra layer that reminds you that as immersive as this is, like I'm sat at my computer typing on this fictional computer, so the distance between me and the fictional character is teeny, just every now and then pushing back against that and reminding you is a useful way to actually build some of that suspension of disbelief. It also helps with a bit of the voyeurism. Like, I think one of the things that attracted to me to this idea was that we're getting very intimate with these characters. So we see scenes between people who are intimate with each other, where their defenses are down, they're in their bedrooms, you're seeing kids talk to parents. These are very private moments. And what we wanted to do was make them feel more real than, you know, if I'm watching a sitcom and there is a husband and wife sat in bed talking to each other, I don't feel at all icky because the camera is invisible. I'm not even aware that I shouldn't be in this bedroom listening to this conversation. And then there's the kind of Hitchcock, David Lynch world where the camera is in the wardrobe and we're spying on people, and it's very clearly a thrill to be spying, and you have that voyeuristic ickiness. What we were aiming for here was somewhere in between, where we were aware that we shouldn't be here listening to these conversations, but there was a closeness to the characters and their stories that we were empathizing with them, and it wasn't feeling too voyeuristic. And I think as well, the reflection element helps give us that little bit of distance, which I think helps with that feeling of voyeurism. And then the last little thing that is an additional way of pushing against convention is the music. So we have this beautiful score that was written by Nanita Desai and performed by the London Contemporary Orchestra, who did some of my favorite film scores like Phantom Thread, Moonlight. But what we do with the music is not scoring the action on screen. What the music does is track what you're looking at through the game, and it kind of scores your meta journey. So if you're looking into a particular character's story and you're digging deeper and deeper, the music will shift to a theme or motif that reflects that character and kind of hang around in that theme even as you start to shift to other characters. It doesn't just match the level of drama on screen. So in some cases, that feels dissonant. And again, it reminds you that this is a slightly artificial experience. It promotes that distance, whilst also kind of giving weight to the emotion that you, the player, are feeling on top of everything. Okay, that was a quick tour. I made lots of space for the translation, so we can now do lots of fun questions.
Donc si vous voulez poser des questions en français, on peut traduire à Sam en anglais. J'ai un micro pour vous. Donc est-ce que vous avez des questions? Le premier... Hop. Si tu es à l'aise en anglais, tu peux la poser en anglais.
Hi, I think your gameplay is very unique, and it reminds me of such gameplay by Quantic Dream, for example, when they did Heavy Rain. And I have a question about how you communicate about this very new type of gameplay. I used to work in Ubisoft, and they were hating the work of Quantic Dream because they thought that the traditional gameplay they were using was more fun. So how you do to do the marketing of this gameplay, which is maybe not fun, but which I'm sure will be a fun adventure?
So with her story, which kind of was similar to this, I did the opposite. Like, I was very opaque. Like, I have a belief that if you, people like to be challenged, people like to be tested, and if you give them something that refuses to guide them, so Ubisoft games will have like 3 hours of tutorials at the start, right? Because they want to make sure everyone understands all the gameplay and don't want to lose anybody and take you through it all. This is kind of the opposite in that, you know, it's provocative. It just says, right, here you go. This is a boring ass computer desktop. But very, so there's like a provocation there to the audience. And I think I get away with it because everyone knows how to Google search. You know, everyone understands, like I was saying with this idea of the metaphor, like with her story that was particularly focused on police interviews, with this being focused on surveillance, like we get what that looks like. Like I have seen scenes in movies where the detective is just sat there scrubbing through footage, trying to find things. So we understand what we're supposed to be doing. And really, in both these games, we give the players huge amounts of freedom, which I think in itself is a reward. But it is still intensely interactive, which I think is sometimes the challenge with the kind of Quantic Dream model, or even more so maybe other games, because they do throw in some nice mini games and stuff. But the actual process of playing this game is to always have your hands on the keyboard, to be watching things, thinking, taking note of body language, locations, words people are using, putting the pieces together in your head. Like there is a lot that is happening in your head. Your fingers are always engaged. We put a lot of effort with Telling Lies into making the scrub mechanic feel expressive. Like the way that you move through videos is not like you would on a YouTube timeline. We refer to it as like it's our Mario jump. Like when you play a Nintendo game, running Link across a field in Zelda or making Mario jump is in itself inherently joyful. And you know, there's a thing we have, the figure of 8 test, where you should be able to just run a video game character around and around and around in a figure of 8, and that should just be fun if everything is set up right. So the scrub here, we kind of balance that. We get the audio right, the feeling, the way in which you have to move your fingers, so that in itself is inherently kind of enjoyable.
Question about the relation between the screenplay and the gameplay. Apparently, things went super well between the screenplay, that was like a matter to work with and to put into the system and the game engine, but I think that things were maybe not so easy, and you had to make change on the screenplay regarding the test you've made. So how do you do, did it happen, and how do you do, because what I guess is it can become like hell to work on.
So the advantage of the way I do things here is, like when I first made Her Story, I come from a traditional game design background, and so in my head, I was thinking I have to create a big flow chart and track everything like that, which would be hell. Like that would just be impossible. Whereas this way, where we have the script and we iterate, so at any given time, I'm only looking at the 3 worst clips. These clips are the hardest to find, and I look at them and I can see what the problem is. And it is like a real word-by-word thing. Like a very boring example is there's this scene where someone talks about blackmail, and there is another scene where someone in English says, "Are you blackmailing me?" So those don't match because of the conjugation of the verb. So we just rephrase those lines. So in both cases, someone says blackmail, and then those 2 scenes become linked. And we just do that again and again and again, with the computer telling us, fix this bit, tweak this bit. So it's reassuring because you feel like at any given time, you're only looking at a small problem. You're looking at the tip of the iceberg, and you just keep doing it until it gets better. Which is, again, it's part of the way that this game treats freedom. Because the hardest thing in a traditional video game or in a Quantic Dream game is everything is linear, and whenever you branch the story, everything gets twice as complicated. And trying to manage that is really hard. Whereas this is more sculptural. So you're just constantly just chipping away.
J'en ai une, moi. I'm a little bit privileged because I had 2 microphones, so I can ask questions. So you say we since the beginning. How many were you to write the script and then give that game designers and all stuff? And then there is a question there.
So that's close to the royal we. On Her Story, it was all me. But with Telling Lies, I worked with, in the writing process, I had a researcher, and then I worked with a wonderful writer, Amelia Gray, who has written on Mr. Robot, the show Maniac on Netflix, as well as incredible books and short stories. So that was two of us working intently on the writing together. And then I have a coder, an artist, a sound person. So the game design side of it is pretty tight.
And for to direct the actors, did you work with a director too? Or a film director? Or so?
I directed the actors. So yeah, back when I was doing traditional video games, I started out doing voice direction, then motion capture direction. So the coolest thing about doing Her Story, when I made the decision to go from making expensive video games to my kind of low-budget indie, I was unsure of how I would tell character-based stories if I didn't have $2 million to spend on motion capture. And so when the idea of actually shooting it to look like a police interrogation came, that was very exciting because I would still get to work with actors and direct them. Because the kinds of stories I tell, for me, like you need an actor's performance to kind of bring those things to life.
So you were speaking a lot about the tooling used for the game design, and I was curious about what you learned from Her Story, and did you had this tooling on Her Story, or did you create it after it for telling lies? And did you, and second part, did you change things on the way people search words and found clips?
Yeah, so yeah, the system there is roughly similar to how things were done on Her Story. The biggest changes, so I wanted this game to be bigger and messier and more colorful and human. Whereas Her Story, it was this single woman talking. Everything was within the formal constraints of the interview. Here, by opening the story up to span 2 years, have all these different characters, it was clearly just getting a lot bigger. And so the biggest shift was this idea that you get dropped in the middle of a clip where the word is spoken, which was kind of a biggish shift in how things worked. So there were lots of little changes that heavily kind of mixed things up. We did try a version early on where we didn't have the constraint. So in Her Story and Telling Lies, if I search for a word, it will give me the first 5 clips that use that word, which essentially helps control things, because otherwise I could just search for the and find every clip. We tried a version where we were like, can we just get rid of that restriction or tweak that? And it turned out that 5 was just a really good number. And then that restriction helped.
Is there another question?
I wonder, how did you think about localization, and did you think about it during the writing process? Because to me it looks like a big hell. There must have been some problems with some words, and how did you deal with them?
So yeah, when I made Her Story, I didn't localize the game, and I kind of assumed it would be too hard to localize. Plus I was a very small team. But we did a Japanese version of Her Story, because there was a Japanese company that offered to do it, and I was like, this sounds like the hardest localization challenge, so we'll see if that worked. And apparently it kind of worked out okay. And then with this one, we went into it knowing that we were going to localize in 12 languages. But yeah, straight up, I mean, the example I gave of conjugating blackmail is the tip of the iceberg. Like, you know, the opening search word there, love. I mean, the English language is very simple in many ways, right? The concept of love, I love you, she loves me, we all love each other. my first love. Like, there are lots of ways that you can use that word that all line up, and the second you drop into Romance languages and you start having gendered conjugations, it's the reason I skipped French in high school and not speaking to you in French. But the saving grace was, because the game wasn't written as this rigid flowchart, because we just tweaked, and so there is some freedom in that structure, and as well you anticipate how your own language might work when thinking of words to search. We found that it kind of balanced out. We did have to do, there is one back-end tweak where we auto-conjugate words and use infinitives. So if you search for a verb in a particular form and it exists in the script in a different form, I think we make that connection for you. So it kind of does a little bit of extra work to help make things easier in languages where that's more complicated. But yeah, ultimately we relied on the fact that there is this organic freedom to how the whole thing works. And the testing, it meant we had to test the game 12 times. If you make a normal video game, if you make Halo, you test it once and then you put the French subtitles in and it's the same game, the enemies appear in the same place, it's the same levels, whereas we have a game where essentially it has 12 different sets of level design based on what language you're playing it in. So yeah, not easy.
So just 5 minutes left, so one question.
For story reason, did you have to, for example, if you don't want a scene to be seen before another, especially the end, for example, of the story, did you have to tweak your system, or did you just put some very rare words in the scene?
Yeah, there is no tweaking or cheating, but more than that, like there is some. The story is robust because you can't ruin the story by seeing any given scene, and it's part of the design really. And the way I was talking about memory and relationships, if you see a happy moment between a couple, and then see the moment where the relationship explodes and it's painful, that is an interesting story. There is a development. Or you see the relationship explode horribly, and now you see the earlier scene, and you have the dramatic irony of knowing where this relationship is going. It's still interesting. In fact, it might be more interesting because now you're seeing this happiness and you feel sad inside because you know it's not going to end well. And so the game has a lot of that built in. As well, there are, because of the constraints, you will see scenes that you might not 100% understand the first time you see it. And then when you've seen these things as well, oh, now I understand what was happening here. So there is some kind of relying on the story. And similarly, like with her story, people would say, well, what if I find the clip that solves the murder? Like, doesn't that ruin it? And it was like, well, there isn't one clip that solves the murder, but as well, the answer of who murdered who in her story is only one answer. And there are far more interesting questions once you've discovered that. So there is robustness in stories can be told in all sorts of different orders. Like if you watch Breaking Bad, they open that show with the end of the first season's arc, and it's exciting, and you're like, oh my God, how the hell did he get there? And then they slowly take you through that. You could get the Breaking Bad version of Telling Lies if you follow a particular thread. So there's a robustness, and there is an amount of one of the beautiful things is this amount of player pacing where, you know, if you're enjoying yourself and you feel like you're making progress, you can wallow in some of the scenes. You can rewatch things or just spend time watching these scenes unfold. If you're feeling like, no, I'm not getting anywhere, you can jump out of a clip, search another word, search another word. Like there is this nice feedback loop that helps people kind of give their story shape.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we have to stop. But thank you very much for all the super interesting questions. And thank you, Sam, for all the super interesting answers. And if you want to ask more questions and if you want to talk with Sam, tomorrow night at 9 o'clock, we're gonna play Telling Lies All Together in the cinéma Gaumont, just 5 minutes around. And so there is 180 chairs, so you can come with friends and we can play all together. It will be a little bit experimental, but I'm sure it will be really interesting. So I invite you to come tomorrow. Bye-bye. Pardon? Yes, for sure. Yeah, all the video clips and all the game will be subtitled. And there will be a translator too, so we can fill the database with French words. Voilà.
One last beautiful cooperation before Brexit.
Yes, voilà. Thank you. Bye.